Hello everyone, my name is Julia Miller and I am an economics student at San Diego State University. Today I will be conducting a literature review on a variety of studies relating to unemployment. Before we begin, let's refresh our memories on the topic of unemployment. The most common measure of unemployment is the unemployment rate. We calculate this number by dividing the number of unemployed people by the number of individuals in the labor force. So who do we classify as someone who is unemployed and who makes up our labor force? People who are jobless, currently looking for a job, and available for work are considered unemployed. Those that are both employed and unemployed contribute to our labor force. So now that we have briefly touched on the basics of unemployment, let's dive into the articles. We're going to start this off light and discuss an article from the New York Times titled, "We May Be Closer to Full Employment Than It Seemed, That's Bad News." This piece stood out to me because naturally we like to think increased employment is good news. Well, Neil Irwin seems to think differently, and here's why. Unemployment has been lower than it has in the past 16 years, but the amount of people out of work has risen. Unfortunately, job creation did not increase as much as anticipated, and the low employment rate is not encouraging more people into the labor force like it should. The number of people who are not considered in the labor force increased by about 600,000 people. The labor force participation rate has decreased simply because fewer people are even looking for work and therefore are not included in the number of unemployed. As I had just discussed, the unemployment rate is determined by dividing the number of unemployed by the amount of people in the labor force. So if there are less people classified as unemployed and more people in the labor force, the rate will drop. Irwin considers this as bad news because the unemployment rate has not increased due to job creation or amount of people working. I thought this article would be interesting to share. We are going to start this off light and discuss an article from the New York Times titled, "We May Be Closer to Full Employment Than It Seemed, That's Bad News." This piece stood out to me because naturally we like to think an increase in employment is good news. Well, Neil Irwin seems to think otherwise, and here's why. Unemployment has been lower than it has in the past 16 years, but the amount of people out of work has risen. Unfortunately, job creation did not increase as much as anticipated, and the low employment rate is not encouraging more people into the labor force like it should. The number of people who are not considered in the labor force has increased by about 600,000 people. The labor force participation rate has decreased simply because fewer people are looking for work and therefore are not included in the amount of unemployed. As I had just discussed, the unemployment rate is determined by dividing the number of unemployed by the number of people in the labor force. So if there are less people classified as unemployed and more people in the labor force, the rate will drop. Irwin considers this as bad news because the unemployment rate has not decreased due to job creation or amount of people working. I thought this article would be interesting to share to start off the discussion because it's important to look beyond the numbers. Without examining the background of certain data, you may come across some misleading information. The next journal we are going to discuss is a study by Nicholas Hillman and Erica Orions that makes a connection between the local unemployment rates and community college enrollment demand. Hillman and Orions find that community college enrollment demand runs counter-cyclical to changes in unemployment. In order to estimate how enrollment demand for community college changes with unemployment rates, they created a model that controls for factors like tuition level, type of employment, income level, and the number of recent high school graduates. They also look at differences among full-time and part-time enrollment, as well as enrollment in metropolitan and micropolitan areas. Previous studies have been conducted on this topic, however these studies primarily focus on price, current wages, income levels, future earnings, and so on. Hillman and Orion's studies differ in that they look at the non-price factors of its relationship, such as demographics, labor market outcomes and conditions, and opportunity costs. Hillman and Orion's pull data from the U.S. Department of Education Integrated Post-Secondary Data Systems, or IPEDS, datasets from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and datasets from the Bureau of Economic Analysis from the years 1990 to 2009. Enrollment levels are measured by fall, full-time, and part-time totals from IPEDS. They also use the U.S. Department of Education's Common Core of data to count for the number of high school completers. Lastly, they use the tuitions reported in IPEDS to measure regional average tuition. This acts as the study's price elasticity controls. Hillman and Orions create a semi-log fixed effects data model to reduce outliers and allow for easier interpretation of elasticities. Community college enrollment levels are transformed into their natural log, and unemployment rate is kept as its percentage value. With this formula, they are able to estimate how a 1% change in unemployment relates to a 1% change in community college enrollment. The fixed effect model allows them to account for things like cultural norms in the community and other factors that are more difficult to measure. When we look at the data, we can see that the relationship between enrollment and local unemployment is counter-cyclical to the business cycle. If we focus on the Great Recession, we can see that in these years it is clear that as the unemployment rate increases, so does enrollment in community colleges. Not to my surprise, enrollment in metropolitan areas is greater than enrollment in micropolitan areas. We see that micropolitan areas had a slightly higher unemployment rate than metropolitan areas, while metropolitan areas enroll a greater number of part-time students than micropolitan areas. The data suggests that enrollment in metropolitan areas is expected to increase by about 2.6 percentage points for each percentage point increase in unemployment, whereas micropolitan areas should only anticipate a 1.7% increase. Hillman and Orions attribute this difference to the fact that metropolitan areas tend to have more commuter students. They also find that full-time enrollment is more sensitive to changes in unemployment rate in comparison to part-time enrollment. For example, full-time employment is expected to increase by about 3.3 percentage points for each 1 percentage point increase in unemployment. The study concludes that those students that are uncertain whether they should go to school or work will choose the school route in times of high unemployment. Hillman and Orions did not look at factors such as gender, ethnicity, and age, which could have affected the outcome of their results. They also mentioned that there were some colleges that opened while they started their research, causing a slight imbalance. Regardless, I believe that Hillman and Orion's study is valid, especially when we think logically about the scenario. If we want to contribute to the growth of our economy, many are more inclined to pursue a higher education. In this next journal, John Schmidt and Dean Baker make comparisons to the U.S. unemployment rate in 1982 and 2009, years in which our country faced extremely high unemployment. There are differences in these unemployment rates when you take into consideration demographics and statistics. In 1982, the population of the United States was much younger, and the population surveys differ in the 2 years. Schmidt and Baker take these factors into account and create an unemployment rate for 2009 that reflects the conditions of 1982 better. After making these adjustments, they find that the 2009 unemployment rate is higher than the rate of 1982. So let's take a look at how they made these adjustments. The reason it is important to take age into account is because younger workers are more likely to switch jobs and have fewer financial responsibilities. Therefore, they can remain unemployed for a longer duration. As a result, younger populations in general have a higher unemployment rate than older people. The current population survey also accounted for more individuals in 1982 than it did in 2009. Without considering the employment rates for the uncounted, the unemployment rate today relative to 1982 will be skewed. To control for the age of the population, Schmidt and Baker estimate the 2008 rates, assuming the age structure of 1982 and vice versa. After these adjustments, we see that the 2008 unemployment rate amounts to 6.6%. The official unemployment rate reported at that time was 0.8% lower at 5.8%. If we adjust for 2009 the same way, it shifts from 9.4 to 10.7%. Let's take a peek at the graph Schmidt and Baker provide in their analysis. We should focus primarily on the first, third, and last bar of this graph. In the first bar, we see the actual unemployment rate in 1982. The third bar adjusts for age as if it were 1982, and the last adjusts for both age and population surveys as though it were 1982. In both, the unemployment rate is already higher than in 1982. I thought this article would be interesting to share because the way we measure and collect data has changed significantly over time, and therefore it's affected the results that we shared with the people. The average person may look at the numbers from these two separate times and make assumptions regarding the economy that are not very comparable. In this next study, ARCS attempts to determine how the state unemployment rate during an individual's teen years may affect their educational attainment considering the income and substitution effects. ARCS uses the same data from a previous study by Angrist and Kruger in 1991 to estimate the returns to schooling with unemployment rate and quarter of birth as instruments. The new instrument ARCS introduces is the average state unemployment rates over 3 years in which the respondents turn 15, 16, and 17. He controls for state of birth as well as year of birth so that we can see how educational attainment varies amongst states with different unemployment rates. ARCS averages the unemployment age up to the age of 17 because it's less likely for students of that age to move out to a different state where there's a better economy. ARCS pulls data from the 1980 Census 5% public use microsample and restricts the model to males because at the time, females had rather low employment rates. At the time, there were also fewer opportunities for minorities, so that is why ARCS restricts the study to white males. Had this study been conducted today, I think the research would be more valid if all groups of earners were included. ARCS references previous studies regarding the cyclical effects of school enrollment to support his research. I found it interesting that he brought up a 1995 study by Betts and McFarland suggesting that community college enrollments increase with unemployment, considering we had just discussed a more recent study on this topic. ARCS finds that a 1% increase in the average unemployment results in a 3.8% increase in schooling. We can see a significant variation in additional schooling between the quarter that these individuals were born. For example, for those born in the third quarter, a 1% increase in unemployment results in a 14.6% increase in schooling, whereas those born in the second quarter experience a 5.1% increase in schooling when unemployment rates increased by 1%. This makes sense because people born earlier reach the legal age where they can leave school before those that are born later. I thought this tied back nicely to the article we previously discussed about community college enrollment. Both find that the enrollment in schooling increases with the 1% increase in unemployment rate. Their data differs greatly, likely because ARCS uses state data and year of birth, whereas Hillman and Orion's look into the data at a local level. ARCS finds in the ordinary least squares estimates that 1 year of schooling results in a 6.55% increase in weekly earnings. The two-stage least squares estimates indicates that 1 year of schooling increases earnings by 10%. Similar results appear with the annual earnings. The OLS model suggests that an additional year of schooling results in a 7.4% increase in annual earnings, while the two SLS models suggest around an 11% increase. ARCS finds that high unemployment in teenage years affected their educational attainment in comparison to those that were teenagers in years of low unemployment. In using the state unemployment rate as an instrument, he got similar results to Angrist and Kruger's model using the quarter of birth. He notes that OLS may be more focused on college years, while 2SLS is more focused towards the high school years. So he decided to test it by using OLS regressions for the number of high school and college years completed. The results prove that the unemployment rate mainly affects the number of high school years. We see a 2.7% increase in earnings for high schoolers and a 0.4% increase in earnings for college students. This suggests that people are likely to not continue on to college because of the poor economy. The final article we are going to take a look at studies the determinants of geographical unemployment rates. Unemployment rates in smaller areas are of interest considering they help in determining the national unemployment rate. Murphy and Hoffler create a demand-supply model to determine geographical unemployment rates. Labor demand and labor supply will help to determine a certain area's level of employment. Murphy and Hoffler reiterate that instead of pooling the entire sample of data, they are pooling certain areas of data with the assumption that smaller areas in the economy are similar to each other. They chose the 9 census regions to begin pooling, and an unemployment rate regression was run for each region. The regressions were compared using an F-test to compare the other coefficients. They found that even the small census regions had different types of economies. Then, pairwise comparisons of the remaining states were made, where 2 state regions were compared with other 2 state regions. The final step tested for similarity of coefficients. They successfully pooled the states into subregions and found that the labor forces in each of the states was small, and put together that it counts for 11% of the total labor force. Here you will see the average coefficient values by region according to the regional patterns. In the Northeast region, relative wage is more sensitive to relative wage than all other regions. There are likely differences in sensitivity to wage because the preferences of workers in different regions vary. Wage increases naturally cause an increase in unemployment because businesses cannot afford to pay as many individuals at a higher rate. In areas, wage increase also prompts more individuals to search for work in such an area and therefore increase the labor force in that particular area. Next, we can look at the coefficients of non-labor income like transfer payments and property income and see if an increase in this non-labor income causes individuals to leave the labor force. Again, in the Northeast region, transfer payments have a positive impact on unemployment rates. A 1% increase in transfer payments results in a 1.41% increase in unemployment rates. Alternatively, in the South region, we can see that a 1% increase in transfer payments results in a 0.41% decrease in unemployment of the region. The North Central and South regions appear to be extremely sensitive to changes in actual gross national product and potential national product. These numbers verify that unemployment rates differ significantly by region and are caused by different factors. Some areas are more sensitive to economic conditions, while others respond to wage changes. I believe we can agree that the unemployment rate affects local and state regions in different ways, whether it be through education or job earnings. Thank you for joining me in this discussion, and I hope you have a great day.